Okay, well, it is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce Dr. Kiran Mehta. Dr. Mehta is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in History at the University of Leicester. She previously lectured at the University of Oxford and King's College London. She has also held a visiting research fellowship at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Germany. Her first book, To Detain or to Punish, Magistrates and the Making of the London Prison System, 1750 to 1840, was published in March 2025. And her paper title today is Fashioning Subjects, Compelling Prison Labourer in England, 1750 to 1855. Please make her welcome.
And thanks everyone for coming. So since we talk about this paper on prison labor in England, it's probably useful if I start by saying a bit about the wider project, which this paper, the research I'm going to be talking about, is a small bit of. So the wider postdoctoral project is an in-depth comparative exploration of prison and penal labor in Britain and its empire, 1780 to 1895. And I'm focusing on three particular sites: England, Victoria in Australia, and Trinidad, but trying to think more broadly is the imperial context in general. And so, yeah, I've just been in Australia for 2 months, mainly in Melbourne, but also Adelaide, Tasmania, and Sydney doing some research because, yeah, I can't, apparently not just happy with Victoria. The broad aim is to provide a critical new perspective on the negotiation of legal and political rights in Britain and its empire in the long 19th century. It probes the intersections between the so-called civilizing mission of penal labor and the so-called civilizing mission of empire under different governmental regimes and within distinct labor markets, asking how the exploitation of prison labor shaped ideas of subjecthood and how penal labor work regimes were affected by the expansion of political and civil rights. It's also an opportunity to explore attitudes towards coerced labor, especially those types that are deemed acceptable. So the 19th century, as many of you know, saw the gradual freeing of labor and the restriction of many forms of unfree work. And of course, that transition was a slow process, and the freedoms won were limited as lots of scholars have rethought free labor in Britain. They've highlighted the innumerable ways in which the British state continued to support employers in their efforts to extract labor at the lowest possible cost. But still, the rhetorical endorsement of free labor and the corresponding discrediting, or in some cases condemnation, of unfree labor was a significant development. Yeah, at the same time that's happening, prison labor is exploding in the 19th century as Britain and its colonies sentence more and more people to both transportation and to imprisonment, both sentences having labor at their heart. And crucially, that is an accepted and legal form of unfree labor, which today still is sanctioned under national as well as international law as a distinct exception to the general prohibitions on forced labor. There's been a huge resurgence of work in forced labor generally and in global convict labor specifically in recent decades, but Britain and its incarcerated workers haven't featured. This lack of interest stems in large part from existing views on prisons and prison labor in Britain. So specifically that after an initial heyday in the 16th century, when local authorities enthusiastically introduced labor systems into prisons of punishment, which were known as bridewells or houses of correction, and then before the 1820s, when authorities in Britain embraced arduous and unproductive types of labor, it's thought that prison inmates in England did little to no work. Because labor was deemed either unimportant or purely punitive historically, it hasn't been a main focus of interest for historians working on prisons in England. So we don't know much about the realities, patterns, or significance of work in British prisons. Additionally, those assumptions have led to a real separation of Britain from imperial histories of punishment and of penal labor. The two systems are not often studied together, and punishment in Britain is presented as categorically different from punishment in the empire, where it's more commonly accepted that productivity and profit underpinned labor regimes. So current perspectives on British prisons that were in need of radical reassessment. For one thing, they're based on little detailed research. They stem mainly from comments made by prison reformers in the late 18th and early 19th century, rather than from archival work. So this stage of the research in this paper is an attempt to map the exploitation of penal labor in England across the early modern and modern periods. It's based on research in around 10 county and city archives in England. And I've got another like 8 that I'd like to see this year. And it draws on quarter session material, correspondence about prisons from magistrates and contractors and prison inmates, as well as architectural plans, parliamentary records, work task books, and various other account books, prison officers' journals, and that sort of material. Labor, I'm arguing, is especially productive labor was central to British prison regimes, much as it was to imperial penal regimes. And I want to argue that the two projects, putting British prisoners to work and putting British colonial prisoners to work, were more intimately related, or at least shared some of the similar experiences and were driven by similar anxieties than is commonly assumed. Reintegrating Britain into an imperial history not only allows us to uncover and seek to explain the commonalities and divergences between penal law, policy, and practice in different regions, but it also permits us to explore the circulation and transfer of ideas, peoples, and technologies across empire and metropole. So without very long introduction, I'm going to talk a bit about how the power to force prison inmates in England was devised and authorized in England. I'm going to start by talking about the legal frameworks that allowed prison authorities to put prisoners to work in England and how those evolved in the 18th century. Then I'll talk about the shape and aims of those labor systems in the late 18th and early 19th century. I doubt I will get to the 2 moments of pushback against prison labor by prisoners, but I'll say why I wanted to talk about them at the end and what I think we could learn about it. Okay. So the power of authorities to force prisoners to work was linked on the one hand to the statutory evolution of imprisonment as a punishment in England, and on the other to customary views on poverty, charity, and contract law. Labor had been bound up with punitive imprisonment in Western Europe since the first prison purposely designed as a punishment, as opposed to a means of safe custody, opened. The House of Correction, or Bridewell, was created in the 16th century to serve as the penal arm of the poor laws. They were part of a series of pioneering poor relief ventures, including the provision of public stocks of work and later the establishment of workhouses that sought to resolve poverty by creating work opportunities for the jobless poor. Within this system, the idle, disorderly, or unacceptably mobile poor who refused to work and who local authorities deemed unworthy of local relief were sent to houses of correction, where they would be confined, corrected, which in that case meant whipped, and set to work. Houses of corrections were specifically designed to punish idleness and to encourage habits of industry, specifically through incarceration and coerced labor. Parliament granted local authorities wide power to compel vagrant prisoners to work. The 1609 Vagabonds Act, which consolidated earlier acts, ordered a house of correction be provided in every shire to set idle persons to work, and that they be equipped with mills, turns, cards, and such like necessary implements of labor. The governor, it specified, shall have power to set rogues, vagabonds, idle and disorderly persons to work, and labor being able. Local ratepayers were not to bear the cost for supporting vagrants' incarceration, rather those confined had to work to support themselves. They, quote, shall in no sort be chargeable to the county for any allowance, either at their bringing in or going forth, or during the time of their abode there, but shall have so much allowance as they shall deserve by their own labor and work. The rules then were designed in part to offset the costs of confining and employing vagrant prisoners, and as an incitement or an inducement to labor. The harder one worked, the better their material conditions within the Bridewell. Houses of correction spread throughout England in the late 16th and early 18th century, set up and founded by local justices of the peace who uniformly established labor systems therein. So at London's Bridewell, for example, prisoner labor was established under 1557 regulations, which provided for the employment of a taskmaster and the setting up of manufactories. Occupations included carrying sand, spinning linen and woolen yarn, beating hemp, working at a corn mill or the bakehouse, and making a variety of goods like globes, silk, lace, shoes, nails, knives, and tennis balls. Those who refused to work were punished by a restriction of their diet, by corporal punishment, or by confinement in a cell so small that both standing and sitting was impossible. Prisons are not just sites of punishment, though. They also hold individuals who are awaiting trial or examination, who are awaiting the execution of their sentence, or for debt and other custodial purposes. Under English contracts law, free people could not form valid contracts under duress, which might suggest that prisoners not legally sentenced to labor could not be forced to work. Yet, as Sonia Taicho has recently argued with respect to 17th century England, the state and its collaborators generally conceptualize prisoners, whether criminal offenders or prisoners of war in her case, as captured commoners who are able to consent to serve without the option to refuse. Imprisonment made men dependent on charity, and the social status and poverty of common prisoners left them no alternative but to agree to work in prison. Another strain of thought explicitly viewed the offer to work in prison for any inmates, and even the requirement to work there, as a form of charity. So with respect to unscrupulous debtors, for example, which is another category of non-convict prisoner, one author contended, quote, "A prison is the fittest place for them, and the best charity to these is to provide so that they may be kept to work. Such understandings of work and of the rights and obligations of commoners help justify the practice of permitting, persuading, and even coercing the labor of non-convict prisoners in England." To facilitate that employment, Parliament in 1666 had passed an act that empowered justices to raise the county rates, so local taxes, to fund work schemes in jails, which was a type of prison that usually served as a site of custodial confinement. They could provide a stock of materials for poor and needy prisoners who they described as living idly and unemployed, or perishing before their trial, or becoming debauched and instructed in the practice of thievery and lewdness in prison. The magistrates could also use that money they raised to hire overseers and to disperse profits to the working prisoners. I won't discuss in detail the different labor practices that sort of evolve in the period between the 17th, 16th, and 18th century, but I'll stress that in prisons that served as sites of punitive confinement across England, which is primarily houses of correction, there's a widespread dedication to putting prisoners sentenced to imprisonment to work, as well as a fairly regular pattern of employment in those prisons throughout England. So there are some important changes over time, most notably that the range of employments contracted. So early attempts to train prisoners in skilled or semi-skilled labor, or in employments that they might pursue after release, had largely been abandoned by the mid-18th century, and prisoners were engaged primarily in menial and arduous tasks like beating, hemp, bruising oyster shells, and picking oakum. By comparison, few authorities sought to use county money to fund employment schemes in custodial prisons, deeming them too costly or inconvenient. Nonetheless, those two are sites, or were sites, of considerable industry. In particular, prisoners played an important role in the prison economy. They provided goods or services to their fellow inmates, selling foodstuffs at the daily prison market, or turning their rooms into chandler's shops or restaurants. It's a period in which the prison authorities don't provide any of those goods, so the only way for prisoners to get them is if they do it themselves. Imprisoned professionals like doctors, lawyers, and writers also carried on their work, and they found new customers within the prison and maintained the ones they had outside. Other prisoners acted as cleaners or servants for their wealthier inmates, but crucially, that work is almost always voluntary, informal, and dependent not only on the prisoners seeking out the work, but on them possessing the skills and means to perform it. There was, though, periodically interest from local and parliamentary authorities in making those prisoners work more and in doing specific jobs. But before the late 18th century, those schemes tended not to amount to much. It will become a problem in the early 19th century, however, which hopefully I'll get to. So the 18th century saw considerable changes in British penal policy. Imprisonment became central to punishment practices, first in dealing with petty criminal offenders, and then later in managing convicted felons. Some new acts authorized imprisonment as a punishment, specified that the offender should be put to labor. Others specified the convict should be put to hard labor, and some made no mention of labor at all. Shifts in sentencing practice, combined with the heightened legalism of the age, prompted some uncertainty regarding the power of authorities to compel prisoner labor. When an offender was convicted as a vagrant, the question of whether they could be forced to work was easily resolved. the 1906 or 1609 Vagrancy Act, which I talked about, and all subsequent vagrancy acts specified that convicted vagrants should be kept to work. But the law was less clear when it came to non-vagrant prisoners. Could a prisoner whose sentence made no mention of labor or hard labor be set to work? How much compulsion could be used? What exactly was the distinction between hard labor and labor? For much of the 18th century, such legal ambiguity does not seem to have troubled local authorities. But in the final decades, surviving records show authorities trying to suss out the extent of their power and also to get a handle on what the practice is actually going on in their prisons. So in Middlesex, for example, there's a committee in December 1772 who asked their jail keeper whether the prison officers, quote, think themselves authorized to compel any prisoner to work at hard labor in any case, but when they are empowered by the committing magistrate where hard labor is expressly mentioned. The keeper dodged the question by responding, he hath very seldom any committed to labor, but tellingly he concluded no prisoner is put to any labor excepting the cleansing of their own ward by turns in order for their preservation. Probably pressured by local magistrates, Parliament moved to place prison labor on a stronger legal footing. In 1782, Parliament passed an act for the amending and rendering more effectual the laws on houses of correction, several of which were dedicated to prison work. The act empowered and indeed directed bridal governors to employ, quote, all such persons as shall be prisoners therein, and kept and maintained at the expense of the county, division, or district in some work or labor which is not severe, although such prisoner was not, by the warrant of his commitment, ordered to be kept to labor. The governor was instructed to keep a separate account of work done by prisoners and to pay prisoners 1/2 of the net profits which he or she shall have earned at the time of their discharge. All prisoners then could be forced to work, regardless of their terms of commitment, and they would be remunerated in part for such labor. The legislation also set important limits. First, the act made a clear distinction between hard labor on the one hand and work or labor which was not severe on the other. Although this was not made explicit, the Act's phrasing suggests that only those sentenced to hard labor could be employed in it. The King's Bench subsequently confirmed this line of interpretation, but also shows that magistrates weren't following it. So in an 1806 court case, the judges ruled in favor of a defendant who questioned the legality of his imprisonment at hard labor in the Surrey House of Correction by pointing to the fact that the statute under which he was convicted did not specify that offenders be put to hard labor. The 1782 Act also provided local authorities for the first time with specific guidelines for employing prisoners, namely that prisoners sentenced to hard labor would work every day unless ill for up to 12 hours with breaks for breakfast, dinner, and supper. There is no mention that prisoners would be remunerated for their labor. The legislation further instructed that bridal governors assigning tasks should adapt the employment, quote, to each person in such manner as shall be best suited to his or her strength and ability, regard being had to age and sex. Crucially, the legislation did not attempt to delineate what hard labor entailed or to specify the range of employments the prisoners should do. Rather, it noted that local justices assembled in quarter sessions were responsible for deciding this, reflecting the preference in this period for giving local authorities control over penal policy. Finally, the Act seemed to reserve the possibility for prisoners to refuse work so long as they were not dependent on the prison authorities for maintenance, so food, bedding, and other necessities. At this stage, authorities were predominantly concerned with the labor of convicted offenders. No comparative attempts were made to clarify the legal position of non-convict work until 1823. This particular emphasis points us to the fact that moves to clarify the legality and contours of prison work stems not only from the fact that prison numbers were rising or with a concern over the legal practices of magistrates, but crucially from a renewed emphasis about and belief in the capacity of institutionalized labor under correct conditions to effect moral reform. Concerns over the state of contemporary morals proved a long-running theme in English thought, but anxieties were particularly acute in the later decades of the 18th century following the disastrous war with America and the outbreak of revolution in France. Such disasters, many believed, stemmed from the general immorality of British society. As one London magistrate, who was a key figure in the reform of London prisons, commented, "There is an immediate connection between the prosperity of a nation and the virtuous conduct of its inhabitants. Corruption and vice, when it becomes general, is more fatal to national happiness and national security than all the designs of the most malevolent and most powerful enemy." Widespread anxiety sparked a new movement to reform manners, and men and women across the country were exhorted to work zealously to correct manners, improve morals, and punish vice. There was wide support for these campaigns among magistracies, those who shaped sentencing practice, and prison administration. Complementing their philanthropic work, which saw them advocate for institutionalizing and setting to work all kinds of marginal groups, like penitent prostitutes, the children of the poor, children seem to be criminal, the children of criminals, orphans, and so on. Prison administrators, complementing that work, moved to reform the habits and morals of convicted prisoners, that is, those sentenced to imprisonment as a punishment through prison discipline. In that context, prison labor took on renewed importance as a central plank of these efforts to effect moral reform. So two leading reformers of the Salford Bench in Lancashire wrote in 1783 that the leading objective of confinement was, quote, to make prisoners better men. It is well known, they continued, that constant and laborious employment is the most friendly to the principles and habits of virtue. Such views were repeated across the country. In Middlesex, the magistrates contended it is unquestionably true that the proper employment of prisoners is one leading step towards their amendment, especially when united with due degrees of solitary confinement. Meanwhile, the Bridewell chaplain in Surrey declared, our principle is to make every man industrious. In Nottingham, the chaplain claimed, quote, we receive a man filthy, diseased, drunken, idle, and profane, and through the prison's regime of labor, religious instruction, and isolation, quote, that man in a short time becomes clean, sober, healthy, diligent, and to all appearance a good moral man. In the late 18th century, therefore, magistrates in England turned to institutionalized labor as a way to remake the character of those at the margins, including prison inmates. They understood idleness, at least of the lower orders, to be immoral, productive of criminality, and a source of national misery. They believed society could be improved by setting the poor and the criminal to work and instilling in them virtues like industry, thrift, and godliness. As a result, they sought and received clear authority to employ all prisoners convicted of crimes and sentenced to imprisonment, regardless of what their sentence said. In the following decades, magistrates across the country expended vast amounts to completely rebuild their prisons and also to totally reform the systems so that they could make prisons proper sites of continual labor. In London, they spent like £200,000 in like a period of 20 years, which is quite a lot of money in the late 18th century. The labor systems that resulted from this momentous moment of reform were in some ways quite diverse and in others remarkably uniform. As I've mentioned already, the actual detail of penal policy was left to elites in the localities. Parliament gave magistrates broad powers both to punish and to tailor punishments, but they did not closely dictate how those powers were used. It's only in the 1820s and especially the 1830s that central figures in the central government tried to control local prison policy and to impose their view of imprisonment. As a result, the systems end up quite diverse. So county authorities had different resources at their disposal, which affected their ability to establish and pursue productive employments. Some were more capable, better able to establish connections with manufacturers and buyers. Some counties also had a lot more active men who were interested in governing and like closely supervising everyday operation within the prisons. Generally, wealthier and or more populous districts had larger prisons, and they established more extensive labor systems and were better able to keep prisoners continually at work. The range of employments in which prisoners were employed were pretty similar across the country, reflecting the limited options and common challenges faced by all prison authorities, including prisoners with very short prison terms, generally between 7 days and a year in England, a lack of skilled knowledge, an unwillingness on the part of many merchants and contractors to give their work to prisons because they thought the quality would be quite low, and also competition with other county institutions like asylums and workhouses for contracts. Common employments included picking oakum, tailoring and shoemaking, needlework, and washing laundry for women, construction jobs like brick making, grinding corn and flour to bake bread. Other less common employments included hatting, making furniture, and printing books. magistrates proudly compiled and then circulated throughout the country these like huge sheets proclaiming all the types of labor that they did and how much profit they made from them. They also made very bold claims about the success of their prisons. So the governor in Southwark in South London told a parliamentary committee, quote, "I remember dustmen, carmen, men of the lower order of society, many men working in the brick fields that had no trade, who are now going on very well to my knowledge." An array of methods for managing prison labor and making it pay developed. So some magistrates sold prisoners' labor to local people at agreed rates. In Kent, the magistrates contracted with outside merchants who paid for an agreed number of prisoners at a set amount to work for him. In Wiltshire, the magistrates published for the public a schedule of the rates of wages to be charged for those who sought to use prison labor, which depended on who was doing the work. So man or woman, the age of the prisoner, whether they're able-bodied or inform, and whether they're age, young and old. The type of work performed in those cases was determined by employers rather than prison authorities. Many magistrates entered into contracts with businesses to produce specific items rather than selling the prisoners' labor specifically. So in some areas, the goods were supplied by outside contractors, but in other places, the county purchased the raw materials themselves. Other times, so sometimes the contractor managed work directly, like in Norfolk, the magistrates paid to build an expensive piece of manufacturing equipment, a mill attached to a treading wheel, and they allowed local businessmen to rent it usually for a year at a time, and the prison labor came with it. So the tradesmen supplied the corn, the grain, the flour for grinding. He oversaw the work and the management of labor. In Buckinghamshire, magistrates made a similar deal, although it's for pumping water, which then could be used for the townspeople with these like pipes that they broke. Well, built very poorly, and then they broke. Other counties preferred to manage prison labor in-house, so to speak. They appointed officers to superintend prison labor, so prisoners worked directly for the county and at the behest of individuals tasked with prison discipline. That practice is really common in London and also in Gloucestershire. So like in Gloucester, prison authorities decided what to make, and then they placed ads alerting the public to the sale of those goods. One printed broadsheet informed the public that, quote, "Various articles in the different branches hereunder stated are manufactured by the prisoners and sold at the jail on the most reasonable terms by the order of the magistrates of the county and under the inspection of the governor of the prisoner. The goods available for purchase included yarn prepared for clothiers, quote, a great variety of ladies' and gentlemen's cloth slippers, boots, and half boots and slippers for the gout, beautiful silk purses of different colors, elegant portable mahogany tables, painted garden sticks, footstools padded for kneeling in churches, rat traps, and so on. At Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire, the keeper of the House of Correction similarly printed notices for the town, but it was about how you could bring your own corn or wheat or grain to have it ground at the tread wheel in the prison at lower rates than you could do it at mills throughout the country, and also for smaller amounts. It wasn't that usual to take small amounts to mills to have them ground, but prisons would do it. In other prisons, like Oxford, the prisoners worked outside the prison by the governor, who in this case had experience in the building trade, so he used the prisoners to help build the canals and also other like fancy buildings in the countryside. Hybrid systems also developed, in which prisoners worked under supervision of both a prison taskmaster and then also outside manufacturers. So in Middlesex in the 1840s, magistrates contracted with a local rug and mat maker, and he paid for 2 superintendents to go into the prison and instruct the prisoners in rug and mat making, as well as in carding, spinning flax, and other materials. And then he obviously took those goods and sold them himself. So far, I've only very briefly mentioned the treadwheel or treadmill. And if you know anything about prisons in England or even in some of the colonies, you might be surprised that it's taken me this long to get there. So the treadwheel is designed by William Cubitt, an engineer and millwright from Norfolk in the late 1810s, and it's a huge wheel with wooden steps, and 10 to 20 people would stand on one side, and as you stepped together, the wheel would turn. It's very arduous work. One inmate said it was like ascending an endless flight of stairs, and prisoners might have to step like anywhere from 12 to 20,000 steps a day. It was enthusiastically adopted by counties across England in the 1810s and the 1820s, and then later in some colonies. In British historiography, the adoption of the tread wheel is traditionally seen as emblematic of the growing punitiveness within prisons in the 1820s. Harsher views on criminals, a dwindling faith in their reform, prompted a tightening up of social controls, and brought a newly authoritarian terror into prison administration. The tread wheel represents the shift towards unproductive labor, purely labor to make prisoners feel pain rather than to profit anything or to learn anything, and also the rejection of reformatory goals of imprisonment. It's all about deterrence. Tread wheels were absolutely introduced because it was a form of labor that magistrates judged to be exceptionally severe. The head of the Middlesex bench endorsed the wheel as, quote, labor which shall really work the body and properly labor which shall really work the body and subdue, properly discipline the mind. Similarly, magistrates in Hertfordshire explained their decision to build a treadmill by noting that it was, quote, likely to be the most effectual mode of employing prisoners who are unwilling to work, and by the irksome fatigue of it, calculated to operate as a punishment for their offences. But treadmills were rarely used for unproductive purposes, at least throughout the first half of the 19th century. Most ground corn or flour, which was then used to bake bread for the prison, and all sometimes sold for the local areas or made for other county institutions like asylums. It was also sometimes used for pumping water for the prison or for the town. All of that work was intended to produce a profit for the county or to save the county money, aims which were constantly at the forefront of local officials' minds because they have to fund the prison by raising the local rates, and inhabitants are not that keen to have the price of prisons increase, especially in the early 19th century, which is economically a very difficult period in Britain. So it's always productive labor in Britain, if possible. When that fails, it's usually because the magistrates have hired incompetent people or the machines break. There's a lot about the treadwheel is an interesting. It's interesting that's taken on because except for in London, where I've seen no issues with the treadwheel, everywhere else in England, the magistrates constantly have problems with them. Like the mill is made wrong, it breaks, the stone has a problem. It's a really complicated piece of machinery, and actually they really struggle to make it work, except for in London where they've got 12 and it's like no problem. The focus on the treadwheel also has tended to obscure the fact that at most prisons, that's not the only type of employment, and in some prisons, like in London, it's not the main method used to employ prisoners. They could have bought more treadwheels, but they actually choose not to. In London, there's in Middlesex, Coldbath Fields, they've got about 1,000 prisoners, about 200 to 200 work on a treadwheel, but the others do other type of work. Prisoners were needed to fill vital roles in the management and operation of prisons. They act as assistants in the infirmary. They act as teachers in the schools. They act as clerks to the chaplains. They make the prison food. They make the prison clothing. They maintain discipline by serving as wardsmen, superintending the actions of their fellow inmates. They built the prisons. They maintained the fabric, the plumbing, the brickwork. Those roles could bring material benefits to prisoners. First, it meant they didn't have to work on the treadwheel, which it was more unpleasant work. And it also meant they got extra food, sometimes a beer allowance, the ability to sell various goods like butter and sugar to their other inmates at a profit, and cash. Some areas especially prize manufacturing and trade tasks. So in Middlesex, they expand those efforts to train prisoners in roles that could translate to jobs outside prison following discharge. They think prisoners don't act as well when they're on the treadwheel, and that it creates like bad conduct within them. And they also think that tailoring and shoemaking might be more beneficial to prisoners, and it might earn them a more profit. Not everyone agrees with them, even in like Middlesex. The chaplain thinks this is a terrible idea because he doesn't believe in the capacity of prisoners to change, and writes at nauseum about that, which suggests his educational work is not very good. because he was also superintending the schools. And lots of other bits of other parts of England, magistrates have much harsher attitudes. So it does really depend on where you're looking at. And the really personality shapes the discipline that's happening in English prisons throughout at least the first half. I probably looked at through 1860. And it's so closely tied to the aims of its magistrates and how they're thinking. It's also important to stress that I won't go into great detail that training is really heavily gendered and linked to age. So it might have helped some male prisoners find jobs outside, but it did not help women who were siloed into skills that were or jobs that were seen as derogatorily as low skilled. That emphasis on productive employment also puts local authorities at odds with Parliament and the Home Office. From the 1850s, prominent figures in those spheres increasingly argued that industrial occupations like tailoring constituted light labor, quote, so much less penal, irksome, and fatiguing than their preferred employments of the treadwheel, the crank, and the shop drill. Those properly merited the designation of hard labor and should be prioritized, even if that work can't be made profitable. That view acquires the force of law in 1865, but justices in England, especially those with more power to push back on the central prison authorities, they just ignore it. More generally, those in charge of local prisons usually argued that prisons throughout the first half of the 19th century should still try and foster moral reform, that they should change the habits of their prisoners, and that they should lead to improved outcomes. In London, officials recognized that recidivism was not solely due to moral failings of inmates. In reports to central prison authorities, they pointed repeatedly to the difficulties faced by inmates in finding employment after their discharge, and also bemoaned the lack of support given to those struggling to re-enter society. And as a result, they expanded prison education, which they thought would help. They created close links and founded some refuges and asylums dedicated to assisting and improving recently discharged prisoners. And they continued to stress the necessity of giving prisoners some of the proceeds of their labor. Though it is important to stress that all of those conditions it's all on the magistrate's conditions. Like prisoners have to behave in a certain way in order to be entitled to that better treatment and that assistance. Yeah, so I had a suspicion when I pitched this paper that I wouldn't get to the section on prisoner reactions to the new labor systems, but I wanted to mention it now because you have to view the actions and views of officials alongside those of prisoners in order to understand how that system works, what it means for the people living in prisons, and also how that system is shaped, because prisoners also play a key role in setting the limits of what is possible and shaping what labor gets done. So I'll say that I would have liked to tell you about two very different cases in which prisoners push back on prison labor. One is one reveals the limits of outward conformity in English prisons, because it looks at one. I've only found two cases in England in which prisoners group together as a collective to stop working. It's much more common for prisoners to refuse to work individually for a few days, or to spoil the work, to have like individual actions of insubordination, not as a group, very rare. So yeah, I found two. One is like not very helpful. It just says like they refused to go to work because they were unhappy about the weight of the bread. I like talked to the baker and now they've gone back to work. But the other one, the prisoners send a petition, and then the magistrates get really angry and send their own letter, and then go and talk to them, and then the prisoners send another petition. So it's really great. And it sort of helps to think about how prisoners in England who knew this was like very controversial tried to make those actions palatable to authorities, but still failed because it doesn't succeed. The other case was about the compulsion of non-convict labor, and that's more of a success story. And it points us towards the conditions that allowed prisoners to shape policy. So it's a prisoner who is held in a jail in Yorkshire, and he gets together with a magistrate who's not happy about the other magistrates forcing pre-trial prisoners to work on the treadwheel. which this magistrate thinks is illegal or unethical. And the man who's held for want of sureties agrees. So they get together and they send a petition to Parliament. That doesn't really work. They go to the King's Bench. Seems not to work. It seems the case seems to go against them. But then Parliament passes 2 acts saying that you can't force prisoners who haven't been convicted to work at hard labor. And you specifically can't let them work on you can't make them work on the treadwheel. Even if the prisoner says they're happy to work on the treadwheel, you can't do it. So yeah, it's quite an interesting case as well, about telling us how parliamentarians and the King's Bench and magistrates and prisoners in areas that are also not London thought about the acceptability of coercing labor and what's owed to prisoners by the government. So I can also talk about that if you want to ask me questions. But yeah, so I'll round up. This paper's tried to make a case for reassessing prison labor in England. It's argued that coerced labor was central to the punishment of imprisonment in England, really from the very beginning and throughout. And there's a real recommitment to seeing labor as central to the punishment of imprisonment in the late 18th century, which continues into the 19th century. There's also a lot more work going on in English prisons than we traditionally think for really long periods of time. That work was intended to be punitive, but it's also intended at various periods to be reformative. It's usually productive. Local authorities always wanted to make a profit, though their ability to do so was severely limited for a variety of factors. But crucially, it desires to sort of make prisons more unpleasant and painful for their occupants, specifically through hard labor, wasn't incompatible with a belief in moral reform. The power to force different kinds of prisoners to work in England was unclear and contested and reworked over the courses of the 18th and 19th centuries. I focused here mainly on how figures within local government, especially county magistrates, looked to harness this authority in the labor systems they set up. But prisoners also played a key role in defining the limits of coerced labor. They too had views on what kinds of work they were willing to do, on whether labor systems might be useful to them, on the legality of their coercion, and on the manner in which they expected to be treated while confined as a condition for their acquiescence to labor.
Thanks, Kiran. Have a sip of water, catch your breath. Would anybody like some sandwiches? Please eat. I'll take questions in just a little.
Just in case I need it. Or maybe wait.
Yeah,
Right?
so.
Thank you. I gave us a big glass.
Okay, excellent.
Nothing worse than being like,
I know.
Are you waiting for questions, Stephen?
I know we have a few in the room, Greg, but
Okay.
Would you like to? I can add you to the queue if you'd like to.
No, I just was checking what was going on.
Okay. So the room camera would show you many happy faces,
Okay.
people feeding themselves, glad they're not in a 18th century London prison. That's setting the scene for you.
no, if you're wealthy in a mid 18th century prison, it's kind of fine.
Yeah.
It's really just if you're poor that has usual, so not right.
Indeed. All right. Well, we'll take some questions. I think Taylor wanted to ask a question. Yeah.
So I really was wondering about if it's worth tracing the family and business connections of these magistrates and how labor,
Mhm.
is that would tell us something about how the upper middle classes tried to, upper middle class families tried to hold on to power.
Mm. Yes. Yeah, I did try to trace well, I did a bit on the like what magistrates in London, what else were they like, what other philanthropic things they were interested in the late 18th century, to see like where they're getting their ideas from, what organizations are they supporting. And then I also thought it would be useful to see if any of them are connected to slavery, because I was curious about what they were thinking about forcing work and abolition as well, attitudes towards that. So I tried that, and I got like fairly far, but other areas are slightly harder because they don't necessarily write their names very helpfully in the records, and some of them I just haven't found much evidence of. Some of them are quite like important figures, especially in the other bits of the UK. They tend not to be middle class, but more like earls and lords, who sometimes periodically get really involved in the local running of the prison and then sort of pull back. But I really like to trace who buys prison labor, because I think so. Some magistrates I've definitely seen think they're doing like a good deed by buying prison goods. They think this is us helping like train prisoners, and we should buy those goods to support them, and that because that most places in England do give the prisoners at least a portion of the profit. So they see that as being like their part of their magisterial duty to like get their corn ground at the tribunal, and buy goods there. But yeah, I'm also quite interested in the other businessmen who decide to take up contracts in prisons, and have them like make their rugs. But I didn't get very far figuring out who those people are and like what they're in, like why they're doing it. But it's part of what I'm still trying to do, because yeah, I like it is so personal. And also lots of the people who apply for governorships, especially in the 18th century, they stress their like trade abilities. So some were bakers, and they say, so I have experience in that specific industry and I can help that for the prison. Others are like hemp dressers. So they say like, I'm a great person to be keeper, especially because lots of hemp dressers had recently taken away their hemp from the prisons because there wasn't a qualified person to supervise the work, and I can do that for you. And sometimes those appeals really work with the magistrates, although in that case, actually, they didn't go for him. Which is interesting. But yeah, thank you.
I think the order I saw the hands was many hands. I think I saw Andrew next, then Alison, then David. Andrew,
Thank you. Distracted by
I was actually saying I took too many archive photos and my iPhone is like exploding and it won't let me look at them on my laptop. So I'd be like, here's a plan of a prison. Here's prisoners working on treadmill, but yes.
I'm sure we missed out.
No, thank you.
I was struck by the fact that it seemed to me that religion did not feature.
Mm.
I might not have the periodization quite right, but until we got to the 19th century,
Mm-hmm.
And you did talk about charity, there was going to be moral issues, but it actually seemed quite a secularized account. And then there was a couple of references to profane, vice, godliness, and then a little bit later, chaplain was mentioned. Is there an absence of religious justifications for imprisonment, for particular approaches to correction, or justifications for the use or limitations on prison labour in the earlier period, or is it just something that you didn't emphasise in your book? Or is it something that actually seems to emerge more actively in the discourse in the 19th century? And is it maybe you said at one point, I think, in the earlier period, there's more emphasis on actually giving prisoners some sort of training that might be useful later on. When it shifts to a more holistic, just punitive approach, does suddenly religion need to step in to justify the approach? And I've done a little bit of reading recently about prisons in Germany and role of chaplaincy and so forth. And a lot of it seems to be that there's a religious Christian justification for the moral benefits, the religious benefits of the penal regime in its entirety, specifically at work. But then, of course, there's the parallel work of the chaplain that's going on as well, which can often then, stand in contrast or competition with other needs of prisons. I just wonder if you could say something about the role or the presence or absence of religion in the early period, but also is there a competition?
Yeah, absolutely. So partly it's because I just didn't talk about it. But it does. So the like Reformation of Manners movement, in which this like there's a renewed commitment to putting prisoners to work, stems in part from that Reformation of Manners movement, and that is very religious, and loads of the magistrates are either evangelicals or sort of like if not in the like sect who they have ties with, then they're still like very heavily involved in like other religious pursuits and associations. So religion is definitely part of it, and they before the 18th century, or before the end of the 18th century, they don't often have chaplains, but in all of the prisons they hire them. Well, actually, in all prisons for punishment they hire chaplains, but in prisons that hold pretrial prisoners, they sometimes don't do that, and they don't see the point of building a chapel. But prison reformers are very religious, and they're very upset by this, and they continually get very annoyed that the magistrates aren't spending enough on religious instruction. Or that there's like they're getting a prisoner to read the prayers instead of like someone properly trained. I haven't emphasized it as much, partly because the prisons that I looked at, religion's important, but it doesn't seem central to the discipline as much as labor to me. But if some areas that is completely not the case, so especially in Nottingham, at Southwell House of Correction, which is like an early leading reform prison. The chaplain is a huge figure, probably bigger than the governor in designing the discipline, and he actually downplays the importance of work and says like the most important thing is religion. But at the same time, that prison is like a center of hatting manufactory, and they are the ones that print these huge like things saying every single prisoner's name and what work they're doing and how much money they've made for like lots of the 1790s. So the labor's pretty central even there. But yeah, different prisons emphasize religion more or less. And actually, well, it's often said by historians of the period that in the 1820s, there's a move away from like the religious, like Christian fry tradition of prison reform, that those reformers thought that you could help prisoners through like kindness and sympathy, and like showing them the light of God. But by the 1820s, or the same reform movements that claim that they're inspired by Fry and people are actually moving away from reform and religion, because they say like actually that's no, these people aren't helped, they can't be helped, and we should emphasize hard work. So often it's actually in England it's the opposite. Like if you're really interested in religion, then it tends to be that you're interested in reform, and therefore you're like not emphasizing hard labor as much. So at least for reformers but then you get Pentonville, so also really big about religion. But yeah, no, it is huge. They're all tied. I mean, labor, religion, and bits of solitary confinement all go hand in hand, and it does just depend in which area, because yeah, there are some very famous prison chaplains who like kind of take over and sometimes get into huge fights with the prison governor about like how much time you should be spending on religion versus work or secular education.
My question is also about religion, and so actually you probably don't need to answer, we'll just move on. But it was a little bit more about the theology of labor,
Mm-hmm.
actually, as opposed to kind of the religious chaplains and the
Yeah.
kind of Protestantism and so forth. But in fact, it's a very similar Christian thing.
Yes, I suppose like linked to the because idleness is like sinful, and then if there is this like belief that if you just even if you just they use this term like give a prisoners a mechanical habit of industry, that alone will do some great good to making them like a better person, because it just the habit of working makes you better. If you're from poor, obviously that doesn't necessarily apply to the elites.
Dave.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. That was very interesting. And one of the things I found particularly interesting was your emphasis on kind of local variation.
Mm.
And you know, getting out of Newgate and actually asking the questions about what's going on in the countryside, in the smaller towns, and stuff, which is, you know, and showing such a varied picture. So thank you for that. I've got a couple of questions, but two very small questions. One is just as a matter of curiosity. It was often the case, I believe, that when women were sentenced to prison, that if they had children, their children essentially went with them.
Mhm.
Just a question about whether those children were set to work at all. Another very small sort of factual question about whether prisoners awaiting execution were set to work.
Mm.
If so, why? And if not, why not?
Mm.
But actually, here's my big question. Sorry, it's about political economy,
Uh-huh.
which is you know, my understanding, say, of the 1834 Poor Law is that one of its principles was that the activities of the workhouse would not interfere with the working of the free market,
Mhm.
and therefore the notion that they would be producing for the market in some way with this labour that did not have to be paid for, etc., was in some way a problem with that. I mean, this goes to its ultimate extreme in, say, with the relief of the Irish famine, when yes, labour was given to make them labour.
Mm.
The whole point of it was that it was pointless.
Mhm.
It had no economic benefit to it whatsoever. Otherwise, you would sort of defy the essential principles of political economy. Was that? Now, I know I'm talking about workhouses and poor relief, but did any of that discourse lead through into discussion about labour in prisons?
So on the kids, normally they were like separated. Sometimes they were separated from their moms and sent to school rather than work. Although occasionally they would like pick some oakum next to their moms, but there was more of an emphasis on like that they didn't often make them work. The executed, I haven't found any cases of them making those prisoners work. I think they're thought of that the sentence wasn't pronounced on them to work, and so they come under that. They don't, and they're not normally in houses of correction; they're in jails. So when the acts say everyone in house of correction has to work, that doesn't apply to the condemned who are in jails.
And they're normally not there.
Yes, although I guess it can kind of depend based on they decide to execute, like in London, it can take a while. Political economy, yeah, I'm really interested in how prison authorities rationalize prison work when there's like growing trade unions, for example. I've only found one case, like literally one moment in which the magistrates say like, oh, and like milling work and grinding corn is great because it won't interfere with the occupations of the honest inhabitants of the town. I mean, the town also does milling, so I'm not really sure. I mean, I guess it's of a lower quality, so they don't do that work as much. Maybe that's what they were getting at. But yeah, I haven't seen them talk about that much. Prison reformers don't, especially from the 1830s and the Home Office, don't want prisoners doing productive labor for much the same reasons why they don't want productive labor in workhouses. They think that prisoners they have this term like putting themselves forward for prison because there's such great poverty that it's better to have a place to sleep and some food rather than to be on the streets. So they think you need a harder type of labor to discourage people from doing that. They need to really fear the prison. The prison has lost its terror. Some magistrates sort of periodically fulfill that, but for the most part, they're like, well, the central government doesn't fund prisons. They increasingly give some grants to them over the course of the 19th century, but most of it is funded by local authorities. So they also don't want to raise if they can make profitable labor and make some of that money back, or offset some of the cost of keep maintaining prisoners. They think that's better. And some of them do just disagree with the central authorities. They say like, no, they are, some of them think they are just truly quite poor. And like they need certain types of assistance. So yes, but yeah, political economy is really interesting, and it's funny how the magistrates sort of push back on it, but it does sort of shift. It's partly why I guess they don't make prison labor isn't that productive, because they actually don't invest loads of sums in making it. So it's always like as little as they can possibly spend while also making it work.
But Regina, and then yeah, and then you want to sort of please after you.
Just wanted to think women's labor and whether thinking of one of the most common ways in which women are in prison is through prostitution, and in colonial prisons you saw how the labor was decided or determined by what kind of crime she committed. So prostitution was more serious crimes that needed more corrective punishment than stealing or murder. But so I'm wondering if you see that kind of gradation in women and hard labor.
I haven't seen any attempts to. In theory, they're supposed to separate the type of labor given based on the crime, but because prison authorities struggle so much to find enough work, they for women especially, but for everyone as well, they mainly just put them in the laundry, especially as the 19th century goes on. Whereas on earlier, they do the same work as men. They'll also sort of beat hemp and pick oakum, but there isn't an attempt to tailor it to the specific crime other than saying like this is technically hard labor, so that person should do that. But actually, because they want the system to work, they tend to like even if the prisoner's been the woman's been convicted of an offense they think is heinous, if that person is really good at what's the word I'm thinking of? Sewing, weaving, then they'll be like, oh well, she's really good at sewing and she's volunteered to teach the other prisoners, so let's give her that, and then we'll give her like benefits, like a certain more money than she would have gotten. So actually the prison inspectors get very angry at local magistrates for prioritizing everyday working of the prison over the way they think punishment should work.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting and stimulating talk. I have a different sort of angle because my only experience with your topic relates to research that I did many, many years ago. And that was part of a project on internment camps in Australia during World War I. And one of the camps that I looked at was housed in a prison that was originally built as a public works project. Public works prison.
Oh yeah.
And that was built in the 1880s. And well, maybe I should say what it was.
Yeah, which one is it?
Yeah, it's Trial Bay on the mid north coast here.
Okay.
The public works project was the idea to build a breakwater into the bay in order to create a safe harbor. So what happened is that a jail was built on the headland, which was then stocked with prisoners, if that's the word. And these prisoners then started building this breakwater. Unfortunately, it didn't work for different reasons. The bay silted up, so it became impossible to use as a harbor. More importantly, there were storms in successive years that washed the breakwater away a couple of times, so then it was abandoned. The jail was deserted, and in 1940 it was reopened as a camp for German prisoners. Now, at the time, I found this very fascinating that you would actually build a jail and then stock it with prisoners and then have this public works prison. And I understood at the time that this was one of the reform ideas that had come from the United Kingdom, but I never had the time, or it wasn't really my idea to go into this. So I was wondering whether you could expand on this a little bit.
And I think it's more of an imperial idea than it is a British idea, but it gets transported to Britain as well. So yeah, I mean, there are, so because I've just been doing Melbourne, and they don't have any convicts transported, but they have people sentenced to long terms of imprisonment, and they have stockades, in which they can, they're not purpose-built prisons initially, they're sort of haphazardly built, and then the prisoners will go out to like quarries, and to build the roads. So they're sort of more like, they are kind of stocks in the sense that in England you are sentenced to a specific prison. You cannot then just be moved to a different prison. In colonial Australia or in Victoria, that you and I guess in Tasmania as well, the governor or the chief secretary and the prison authorities can move the prisoners to wherever they need the labor in a way which you don't do in England. You're in your prison, and it's very common to build breakwaters.
But sorry, this was much later. We're
Yeah.
not talking about convict labor here.
No, they're still the same. So they're not convicts. It's
Civil,
what type of civil prisoners? Like
well,
not
the
criminal.
convict system, they have been convicted in Australia.
Yeah.
So forth.
No. So that's what I'm talking about in Melbourne. The exact same thing. And that system, so that's in the 1850s, and they also built a public works prison, the Breakwater, and the Adelaide does the same thing. They open a public works prison in 1860s, 1870s, Yarra, and then that actually gets transported back to Britain, where their convict system, so people who probably would have been transported, but once transportation ends, they get sentenced to penal servitude. Completely different prison system than what I've been talking about, which is just people sentenced to imprisonment rather than penal servitude. They have their own prisons, and they work as public works prisons for one of the sections. So England takes that system that was pioneered in the colonies. But yes, very, very common for them to do that. They love public works for prisoners.
People have been waiting very patiently.
I have a really short question because the other people have mostly important questions. So I feel like is there any attempt to trace what happened after the prisoner release? Are there if they're trying to really the prison authorities trying to say, oh yeah, this prison after they release proper people?
So there is some attempt, again, taken from like Australia, really pioneers that, for people sentenced to penal servitude, which then becomes like, because they're paroled and then released. In local prisons, no, there isn't. But as they start creating, as prisoner aid societies and discharge associations are created in the 1850s and 60s, there is some attempt made by some prison officers to like communicate with them and see how like what's happened to them and to use them as success stories. And I've tried to look at some of the records of discharge prisoner associations, but I've looked at the ones in London, which aren't super helpful, and a lot of those people are sort of encouraged to emigrate either to Australia or to Canada and America. And then they record people who come back to visit and say like, oh, I had such a wonderful time and you set me up for life and thank you so much and here's some money to the girls. But yeah, that's quite interesting. But the only other one I've found lots of evidence for is in Dorset, which I haven't gotten to yet because it's pricey to go, but I would like to because Dorset sounds nice as well. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thanks so much. Fantastic and great responses to questions too. I really and really making me think about the way that labour's function. I'm primarily a historian of Australia at this period, and so seeing how labour is functioning in England is really very helpful. And of course, my interactions with the English legal system of this period are primarily looking at people and transport. And so transportation is fundamentally a labour. And so, yeah, where does transportation fit into this? Seems to, and you've hinted at that.
Yeah, I mean, I think both transportation and imprisonment are like designed in the 18th century to be labor extraction. Transportation more as like genuinely like colonizing and producing goods and building the there is more profitable labor. There's more output. But they're always people who are like they're the group of people who British authorities think aren't reformable. So it is interesting that it is a much harsher system as well, the like colonial labor forms. But it just feels like compared to Britain, almost like the ones I've looked at still seem like the like punishments they can give. So not like in how they operate necessarily, but the rule system is like there's a lot more powers of punishment than there are in British prisons, in which you couldn't just like sentence people to solitary confinement for very long in England.
The systems of solitary confinement come in
later.
Right?
Yes,
That's
yes. So I'm thinking of the later period, not the early periods. Part of why they want to get rid of transportation is that they're worried it's like too good, that convicts are like really excited about going out because the prisons are worse. And like you can start a better life and also with the gold rush and like more opportunities for wealth, whereas in Britain there's like economic depression. But yeah, I think they're two parallel systems in which both are about extracting labor. One is thought in Britain, it is thought people you transport are the like more serious offenders and the ones you're not convinced would be reformed at home, either because of the nature of their offenses, the type of person they are, or that like they think they're better for like building roads and things. Like they tend to be older. You get like in the early period when they first start substituting imprisonment, or when transportation is paused to the North American colonies because of the outbreak of the war, they still keep sentencing people to transportation anyways. They could put some people on the hulks and put some people in houses of correction, and the people who go to houses of correction are women or old men. So that's seen as like more a punishment for those people in that period, and it is only over time that magistrates who are most of the people and judges or the people doing the sentencing come to think that you could expand the sorts of people who are sent to prison at home and who could be reformed at home. But transportation comes to take the place of all the, especially in London, of the people who are sentenced to execution, but of whom it's thought that they don't really want to execute because it's not feasible to execute that many people. So that's how I see the relationship between the two.
One other question. I might take chair's prerogative and ask a question unless anyone's no. I wanted to ask you, Kiran, this period of the late 18th century, early 19th, where you've described this expansion of Britain's prison system, is also the period of the real take off the Industrial Revolution. And so I'm curious to know, as the prisons are expanded, is there any attempt to bring steam power into them, or to have a kind of industrialized factory style labor? Or is it all, because the image of the treadwheel is very much manual labor, pushing, Sisyphus, like Sisyphus rockets, doesn't feel very mechanized, but is there any kind of attempt to mechanize or use steam power?
Yes. I'm trying to think of specific because I mean a lot of it is more like out of date manual types, but in London you get that is where they have the money to afford sort of more expensive machinery and better ability to like raise the rates on loans to take out larger loans and do it. So they do, because they get like mechanized maybe, or like looms, but other county prisons much less common. But maybe into the like 1860s, definitely not by the 1850s. They're almost all hand done. It doesn't really help the magistrates say like the things they're doing are useful for people's skills as they are training them in things that aren't helpful. But I guess the laundries are probably steam at some point. But yeah, they unhelpfully don't talk a lot about the actual process of how the laundry is done. They just say how many people are in it, which is annoying.
All right, well, will everyone join me in thanking Kiran for one of the talks? Before I let you all go, just to say that we will have one additional bonus seminar this term, week 11, with visiting scholar Lucy Dunlop from the UK. So if you're not too, you know, don't feel like you're pushing the wheelhouse of marking and assessment, and you can bring yourself along. Great to see you there as well. All right, thanks a lot.